A map that does not exist, yet appears in fragments across old atlases, whispers of towers too vast for their time, cities traced in symmetry that no modern engineer can explain. They call it Tartaria, a civilization erased not by the slow erosion of centuries, but by something sudden, deliberate, and almost unspeakable. In archives yellowed with age, in the dust of European libraries, faint outlines reappear, domes that gleam like impossible suns, machines that could have harnessed energy without fire, and chronicles that seem to have been rewritten to conceal rather than preserve. What is it about this phantom empire that makes it return again and again in rumors, in contested maps, in faint lines of architecture stretching from Moscow to Samarkand? Perhaps it was never meant to be remembered, and yet fragments rise like bones from forgotten soil. Some say the great fires of the 19th century were not accidents but resets, flames devouring cities to erase technologies that did not fit the narrative of progress. Others point to star-shaped fortresses scattered across continents, all designed with geometric precision that hints at a shared code, a vanished blueprint. If Tartaria existed, it would mean that history itself has been edited, that the timeline we walk is not the only one that ever was. And if so, whose hand held the pen that rewrote the past? Welcome to ARCHAEON. If you're drawn to stories like these, the ones that live in the shadows between what we see and what was made to disappear, feel free to like and subscribe only if it feels right. And let me know in the comments, where are you watching from? And what time is it for you right now? I love seeing our little map of watchers light up around the world. The silence of a burned city always carries a strange weight. In the charred streets of San Francisco after 1906, in the hushed ruins of Chicago after the fire of 1871, and in Moscow's scorched quarters of 1812, witnesses spoke not only of loss, but of a kind of erasure, as though entire blocks had never been meant to remain. Amid the smoke and the dust, questions arose that never quite found their answers. Why did so many fires of the 19th century follow the same peculiar pattern, consuming monumental stone buildings whose very construction seemed far ahead of their time? What force moved silently beneath these disasters, and why do echoes of Tartaria appear each time scholars retrace the outlines of what was lost? In forgotten corners of architectural drawings, the puzzle emerges. Photographs of cities before the flames reveal vast structures crowned with domes, towers gilded with spires, and arches so immense that one wonders who built them and by what means. These were not minor edifices, but public halls, exhibition palaces, and courthouses, assembled in ways that seem to defy the tools available at the time. Some call them remnants of a world fair. Others insist they were inherited from something older. Could these buildings have belonged to a civilization erased not just by time, but by design? The narrative of Tartaria begins here, not in myths alone, but in the stubborn survival of forms, geometry repeating across continents. Star forts with their precise bastions appear from India to Italy, from the frozen rivers of Russia to the Caribbean shores. Historians tell us they were the military fashion of early modern Europe, spread by colonization and necessity. Yet when viewed on old maps, they form a web that looks less like defense and more like a circuit, a pattern of energy, a flow redirected across land. Could fortresses have been something more than tools of war? Were they perhaps nodes of a forgotten science, built upon principles long lost to us? The chronicles of travelers and geographers sometimes leave hints. In early European accounts of Central Asia, names surface that do not fit neatly into modern boundaries. Tartary, stretching in vastness from Siberia through Mongolia and down towards the Caspian. A word dismissed now as a relic of ignorance, yet on maps of the 17th and 18th centuries it stood boldly, a territory larger than any empire acknowledged today. Within its borders, legends describe cities glittering with strange metals, towers that could capture the voices of the heavens, and peoples who mastered arts the West could not fathom. If Tartaria was simply a cartographic mistake, why did its name persist across so many sources, drawn and redrawn by hands separated by oceans? Some researchers point towards the universal expositions of the 19th century, those grand world's fairs where impossible palaces seemed to rise overnight, only to vanish in flames or demolition soon after. The Great White City of Chicago in 1893, built in dazzling neoclassical style, astonished visitors with its sheer scale and elegance. But soon after, most of it was destroyed or dismantled, as if the world was never meant to keep such architecture. Were these expositions mere temporary marvels, or did they serve as stages to reveal and then erase the remnants of a forgotten culture dressed in the language of progress? Official histories speak of wooden scaffolding, plaster facades, and temporary designs. Yet in old photographs, the weight of stone is undeniable, the carvings intricate, the proportions massive. Why construct something so monumental only to tear it down almost at once? Some whisper that these fairs were not exhibitions of new achievements, but funerals for an older knowledge, staged spectacles masking the demolition of Tartarian inheritance. The resistance to this idea is fierce, for it questions the foundations of how history is told. Mainstream scholars argue that the term Tartary was simply a European shorthand, an imprecise name for lands not yet explored, a placeholder that vanished once knowledge deepened. The fires, they say, are tragic but ordinary, caused by human error, wooden infrastructure, and the hazards of crowded cities. The world fairs were temporary because they were meant to dazzle, not endure. Every element of the Tartarian hypothesis, by their account, dissolves under scrutiny. And yet one must wonder, why then do the coincidences form such an insistent chain? Perhaps the truth is less a single revelation and more a shadow cast across centuries. Myths of lost civilizations echo everywhere: Atlantis beneath the Atlantic, Mu under the Pacific, Hyperborea in the Arctic light. Could Tartaria be another such memory, not wholly fictional, but a reflection of something half-forgotten, distorted by time and the erasures of empire? The possibility unsettles because it suggests that history may not be a steady march forward, but a palimpsest, written over again and again, each civilization inheriting fragments while concealing the rest. Some theorists point to technology as the true key. In old photographs, strange devices sometimes appear: towers crowned with metallic spires, curious antennas rising above domes, machines whose purpose no one has explained. Were they simply ornamental lightning rods, or evidence of a different understanding of energy, one not rooted in coal or oil? The resonant hum of Nikola Tesla's experiments at the turn of the century feels eerily close to these questions. Was he rediscovering principles that others had once mastered? Could Tartaria have been a civilization built upon resonance, vibration, and the harnessing of natural frequencies, a science buried before it could spread too far? If so, who buried it, and why? Was it the slow decline of a culture, or an active suppression by forces seeking to shape the modern world in their own image? Some point to the expansion of empires in the 19th century, the British, the Russian, the Ottoman, all carving borders across lands once called Tartary. As maps were redrawn, so too were narratives, until the very name of the civilization vanished from textbooks. Erasure does not always come with fire. Sometimes it comes with silence, with the quiet refusal to remember. The paradox lies in how much still lingers despite attempts to forget. In remote Russian villages, wooden churches bear designs uncannily similar to the domes of Istanbul and the palaces of Vienna. In forgotten archives, maps label a land so vast it seems almost to mock our certainty. In the faint geometry of star forts, in the impossible construction of long demolished halls, in the curious anomalies of architecture that seems too old, too advanced, the ghost of Tartaria waits. Perhaps all of this is illusion, the human mind seeking pattern where none exists. Yet illusion itself tells us something, that deep inside there is an intuition that history is incomplete, that what we have been told does not satisfy. Is the insistence on Tartaria not merely a conspiracy, but an instinct, a subconscious recognition that erasure has occurred, and that beneath the smoke of fires and the silence of archives, a different story struggles to breathe? And so the question remains, was Tartaria ever real? Or is it a mirror reflecting our own doubt about the histories handed to us? The fires, the expositions, the strange geometry of fortresses, they may be coincidences, or they may be fragments of a puzzle whose outline we cannot yet see. Like a dream half remembered, the pieces blur and fade when grasped, yet they return in the quiet hours, urging us to listen. What if a civilization once spanned the vast heart of Eurasia, only to be struck from the record, its knowledge scattered, its name consigned to the margins of old maps? If such a truth lies buried, it would mean that everything we know is but one version of a story, carefully chosen, meticulously pruned, leaving behind only what serves the present. Perhaps Tartaria's greatest secret is not its existence, but the reminder that the past itself is fragile, and that memory can be rewritten. The shadow of its empire may stretch further than we think, not in monuments that remain, but in the haunting suspicion that something vital has been taken from us. And as the fires fade, as the smoke of forgotten cities drifts into silence, the question lingers like a whisper at the edge of sleep. What was lost, and who decided it must be forgotten? When old maps are spread across a table and the finger traces the shifting outlines of empires, one detail refuses to vanish: the word Tartary. For centuries it appeared on European charts, sketched over immense stretches of Asia, sometimes reaching to the Arctic, other times spilling down towards the Himalayas. Then, almost suddenly, it disappeared, replaced by more familiar labels: Russia, Mongolia, Siberia, Kazakhstan. To the historian, this is no mystery at all. It was simply the consequence of growing geographical knowledge, of surveyors pushing deeper into unknown lands. But to the quiet observer, another possibility arises. What if the erasure of that name was not simply progress, but an act of rewriting? The 16th and 17th centuries were filled with travelers' tales, many unreliable, but not without resonance. Chroniclers spoke of cities with roofs of copper and gold, of temples reflecting the light of distant stars, of roads so straight they seemed drawn by geometry itself. Some maps even inscribed not just Great Tartary, but specific regions within it: Independent Tartary, Chinese Tartary, Siberian Tartary. The variety suggests not ignorance, but familiarity, as if the name was used with purpose. Yet in modern retellings, Tartary is reduced to a vague myth, a convenient placeholder for lands Europeans did not yet control. Why then do the descriptions hold such texture, such stubborn detail, if nothing ever stood there? Consider the travel accounts of Marco Polo, whose stories carried whispers of grand cities in Cathay and beyond. His words, mingled with exaggeration and wonder, still leave shadows of architectural splendor, of communities governed not only by force, but by vast knowledge. Later writers echoed similar notes. And in Russia, archival fragments mention lost towns and cultures swallowed by steppe and snow, stories passed from one generation to another with the melancholy weight of memory. Could all of this be merely imagination? Or are they the frayed threads of something larger, an empire that resisted the order of later powers, and so was consigned to oblivion? One cannot help but notice the peculiar architecture that stands, often without explanation, in cities once under the broad sweep of Tartary's name. In Kazan, Samarkand, Bukhara, domes glisten with tiled geometry so intricate it defies the tools said to have been available at the time. Across Siberia, wooden structures rise in forms that echo the elegance of palaces thousands of kilometers away. Even in the heart of St. Petersburg, built under Peter the Great's vision of a Western empire, columns and arches appear as if transplanted from another order altogether. Historians attribute these marvels to Islamic, Persian, or Byzantine influence, filtered through local genius. But what if the influence was not external at all? What if it was the remnant of a unified knowledge, one erased and then rebranded by conquerors who claimed it as their own? The question deepens when one observes the uncanny similarity between structures spread across the globe. The star-shaped fortresses of India echo those in Italy. The bastions of the Caribbean mirror those on the Russian frontier. Each fortress is said to be born of European military design, spreading outward with conquest. But when viewed as a global web, the pattern resembles something more deliberate, like a grid imposed upon the earth itself, a network aligned with principles we no longer understand. Could this have been part of Tartaria's inheritance, a science of spatial harmony that married architecture with energy, defense with resonance? Skeptics respond with certainty. Tartary was never a state, only a term of convenience. Maps labeled it because Europeans lacked detail, and once exploration advanced, the name became obsolete. The fortresses are nothing more than products of necessity, following the geometry of defense. To them, the mystery evaporates in the light of rational explanation. Yet the rational answer often leaves behind a silence, a hollow that lingers. If Tartary was only a fiction, why did its erasure require such completeness? Why did its memory need not only to fade, but to be actively replaced, until even the word itself sounds conspiratorial in modern ears? Perhaps this is the true measure of power, the ability not only to rule the present, but to edit the past. By the 19th century, with empires expanding across Central Asia, the name Tartary was all but forbidden in official texts. Schoolbooks omitted it, maps ceased to bear it, and the people once called Tartars were divided into new categories, their histories fragmented, their identities redrawn. This is not the natural progress of knowledge, but the systematic rewriting of geography into narrative. And if geography can be rewritten, what else can be hidden? The sense of something missing becomes stronger when one considers the great resets of history. Those sudden ruptures that leave civilizations fractured, their knowledge scattered. The collapse of the Bronze Age, the fall of Rome, the great fires of the 19th century. All moments where continuity falters, where what was known slips into silence. Could Tartaria have been caught in such a rupture, its memory extinguished in favor of a new order? And if so, what knowledge was taken with it? Among the more haunting suggestions is that Tartaria mastered a form of technology we have since forgotten, one rooted in resonance, vibration, perhaps even atmospheric electricity. The curious towers with metallic spires that crown old buildings, the ornate domes with concealed mechanisms, the seeming impossibility of constructing such vast halls with the tools of their supposed era, all raise questions. In the hush of speculation, some imagine that these were not simply aesthetic flourishes, but instruments tuned to the forces of the earth, gathering energy without combustion. If such a science existed, the implications are staggering. And perhaps that is why it could not be allowed to survive. The thought is unsettling, for it suggests not just the loss of an empire, but the deliberate burial of an alternative path for humanity. Imagine a civilization powered not by coal and oil, but by the harmonics of the planet itself. Imagine an order where architecture was both art and machine, where cities were designed as living instruments of energy. Such a vision threatens the foundations of modern progress, built as it is on scarcity and competition. To allow Tartaria to be remembered would be to admit that another world was possible. Still, doubt intrudes. The historian's voice insists that there is no solid evidence, no surviving texts or artifacts that can be placed beyond dispute. The photographs of strange buildings are explained as grand but ordinary feats of 19th century ingenuity. The maps are relics of ignorance. The fires are accidents. And yet the unease lingers. The human mind resists simple dismissal when confronted with too many coincidences woven together. One can almost feel the weight of something concealed, not erased completely, but buried beneath layers of explanation, waiting for those willing to question. And perhaps that is the essence of the mystery. Not proof, but the persistent absence of it. The very emptiness becomes suspicious, as though silence itself testifies to what has been denied. In this way, Tartaria becomes less a question of history and more a meditation on power, memory, and forgetting. To doubt it is not to seek a lost empire, but to acknowledge how fragile our hold on the past truly is. The maps that once bore its name are gone, replaced by borders we accept as eternal. The architecture stands in fragments, admired but misunderstood. The fires are written off as accidents, the demolitions as progress. Yet the whisper endures, faint but insistent, like a thread running beneath the surface of time. Could it be that the greatest mystery of Tartaria is not whether it existed, but why so many forces conspired to ensure we would never ask? As the candle burns low and the maps fade into shadow, the question remains, suspended in silence. What other names, what other empires lie hidden behind the veil of history, waiting for someone to remember? There is a strange familiarity in ruins, as if stone itself remembers more than the books that attempt to explain it. Across the Eurasian steppe, where winds carve patterns into endless grass and winters bury the land in silence, fragments of forgotten architecture rise unexpectedly. Towers leaning alone in desolate plains, remnants of citadels that no one claims to have built, walls of brick and stone stretching toward horizons no longer mapped. Scholars classify them as fortifications from various khanates or later Russian conquests, but many bear designs that echo far beyond local traditions, recalling the intricate masonry of Samarkand or the star-like precision of European forts. These anomalies raise a question that never seems to settle. Were they the last outposts of something larger, fragments of Tartaria dissolving into the soil of empire? The chronicles of Central Asia are filled with absences. Nomadic confederations rise and vanish. Kingdoms emerge only to be swallowed by stronger neighbors. Yet in the accounts of Persian historians, Chinese annalists, and even Russian explorers, there are fleeting mentions of cities too large, populations too numerous, for which no trace remains. Timur is said to have passed through lands already filled with vast settlements. Centuries later, travelers described towns with wide boulevards and markets bustling with goods from distant corners of the world. And yet when modern archaeology turns its gaze upon these sites, the silence is deafening. How can so many reports point to splendor where only dust and empty foundations remain? Was there a deliberate cleansing, an erasure so complete that memory itself faltered? The mystery deepens with the scattered star forts still visible across Siberia and Central Asia. Some lie abandoned, their earthen walls overtaken by vegetation. Others were repurposed, their geometry folded into new urban plans. Military historians insist these forts are European in origin, brought eastward during Russia's expansion. But the sheer spread of them, and their uncanny resemblance to those in lands untouched by European settlement at the time, provokes suspicion. Were they part of a forgotten system? A network once spanning continents? If their design was meant only for defense, why then do they so often appear aligned with rivers, trade routes, or even magnetic anomalies? The possibility arises that these were not forts alone, but instruments, devices of an older science, masked in the language of war. It is here that echoes of Tartaria merge with other myths of lost civilizations. Atlantis drowned in a single night, Hyperborea shrouded beneath eternal ice, Lemuria swallowed by the sea. Each tale tells of knowledge and splendor extinguished, leaving only fragments of memory. Tartaria differs, however, for its traces are not only in legend but in documents, maps, and ruins that still stand. Its erasure is not attributed to a natural catastrophe, but to something more subtle: conquest, rewriting, fire. What does it mean that this possible civilization was not destroyed by nature, but by hands intent on reshaping the world? Consider the curious timing of the great 19th century upheavals, the Industrial Revolution, the acceleration of empire, the sudden rash of fires that devastated major cities. Could these events have been intertwined, a global reset designed to obscure the remains of an older order? Chicago in 1871, Boston in 1872, Moscow in 1812, San Francisco in 1906, all consumed by flames so intense that buildings of stone crumbled as if they were no stronger than wood. In each case, the rebuilding ushered in new architectural styles, new narratives of progress, while erasing what had been there before. Was this coincidence, or a calculated removal of Tartarian remnants that stood in the way of a carefully constructed modernity. The skeptic insists that fire is common, that wood-built cities are tinder waiting for a spark, but the sheer repetition, the consistency of destruction across continents unsettles the narrative. The thought forms, if a civilization's presence lingered too clearly in its architecture, perhaps fire was the simplest way to remove it. One cannot destroy stone easily with neglect, but with enough heat, even the strongest masonry fractures. Could fire have been the chosen instrument of forgetting? Into this haze of speculation enters the question of technology. Old photographs reveal details that escape notice at first. Elaborate towers crowned with metallic rods, domes with concealed apertures, entire streets lined with buildings whose facades resemble not mere ornament, but patterns that evoke circuitry, resonance, vibration. Some researchers draw connections to Nikola Tesla, whose experiments with wireless energy at the turn of the century hinted at possibilities far beyond conventional science. Was he rediscovering something ancient? If so, might the architecture of Tartaria have been a living memory of similar knowledge, hidden in plain sight until erased? Yet even Tesla is remembered as eccentric, his most ambitious visions never fully realized. The world chose a different path. Coal, oil, wires strung across continents. But what if that choice was not natural progress, but the consequence of eliminating alternatives? The possibility is chilling, that an entire civilization's achievements were deliberately obscured to ensure humanity followed a narrower road, one controlled by those who claimed the right to dictate progress. If Tartaria was real, then perhaps the true conspiracy is not about its existence, but about its erasure to secure a future shaped by scarcity and control. The parallels to other cultural erasures are striking. The burning of the Library of Alexandria, whether by Caesar's armies or later by other hands, obliterated centuries of knowledge. The destruction of Mayan codices by missionaries left us with only fragments of an entire worldview. Even in the 20th century, wars annihilated archives, manuscripts, entire cities filled with memory. Each time, humanity was forced to begin anew, often in directions convenient to those who survived. Could Tartaria have suffered the same fate, its memory cut away so that new powers could build atop its silence? There is also the curious persistence of oral traditions. Among Siberian peoples, stories speak of great cities swallowed by the earth, of towers that once reached toward the sky, of floods that swept away whole nations. In Central Asian folklore, tales of golden palaces and vanished empires appear like echoes, stubbornly clinging to memory. Such myths may be dismissed as symbolic, but they may also conceal fragments of truth. The human mind does not always invent from nothing. It preserves in the form of story what cannot be explained. Could these whispers be the final traces of Tartaria, surviving where written record was destroyed? To entertain these questions is to confront the fragility of history itself. For every archive preserved, how many more have burned? For every monument that survives, how many lie buried beneath soil, forgotten by design? The historian insists on evidence, on proof that can be held, dated, catalogued. Yet sometimes the very absence of such proof becomes the most compelling evidence of all. Erasure leaves a pattern of silence, a void that resists explanation. And in that void, Tartaria waits, whether as a real civilization lost to conquest, or as a reflection of humanity's own fear that history is never as complete as we are told. Perhaps it does not matter whether Tartaria was an empire, a confederation, or merely a name inscribed on maps. What matters is the instinct that rises when we notice the gaps, when we sense that something vast has been hidden from us. This instinct is a form of memory, deeper than text, older than record. It whispers to us in the quiet hours, when the mind wanders through ruins and imagines the voices that once filled them. And so, the mystery remains unresolved. Are the towers and forts scattered across the steppe mere curiosities, or are they the last signatures of a lost order? Were the fires that consumed great cities accidents of chance, or deliberate acts of forgetting? Was the disappearance of Tartary from maps the triumph of knowledge, or the silencing of a rival narrative? In the stillness of night, as the winds move across empty plains, the question lingers like a shadow too vast to dispel. If Tartaria truly existed, what else has been buried with it? And how much of our history is only the story we have been allowed to keep? In the dim light of forgotten archives, the story of Tartaria grows, not through what is preserved, but through what has vanished. There is a strange silence in the shelves of European libraries, where earlier maps once labeled vast expanses with that enigmatic word. By the dawn of the 19th century, Tartary disappears almost completely, replaced by names that fit the empires of the day. To many, this is explained simply as progress. Cartography became more precise, explorers charted regions once vague, and the need for a broad, imprecise term faded. Yet the abruptness of the change unsettles, as if a decision had been made not merely to refine geography, but to erase a presence that no longer fit the new order. The pattern mirrors other acts of disappearance in history. When Constantinople fell, manuscripts of ancient philosophy vanished, some resurfacing centuries later in altered form. When the Spanish arrived in the Americas, entire libraries of codices were consigned to flames. Knowledge does not always die naturally. It is often buried deliberately, and the void it leaves speaks louder than the words themselves. Tartaria, then, becomes a question less of geography than of silence. Why did the silence need to be so complete? There are fragments that resist erasure. Engravings from the 17th century show cities with towers and domes in regions now thought to have been sparsely populated. Travel journals describe urban centers of surprising scale, their marketplaces alive with trade between east and west. In the Russian chronicles of Siberian conquest, there are mentions of strongholds, walled towns, and unfamiliar peoples whose memory fades quickly from subsequent accounts. These fragments do not form a complete picture, but they create an unsettling outline, as though something vast once stood where now only emptiness is remembered. The architecture of the 19th century deepens the mystery. Across Russia, Europe, and even North America, monumental buildings appear in astonishing similarity. Courthouses, cathedrals, exhibition halls with domes so massive and facades so intricate that even today their construction provokes questions. Many of these structures arose suddenly, their origins shrouded in official stories of rapid construction by architects who seemed almost too prolific. Some of these buildings are said to have been temporary, designed for world expositions, yet in photographs they possess the weight of permanence, the detail of a tradition already mastered. Could these edifices have been inheritances, remnants absorbed into new cities, explained away as the products of a modern age, when in truth they were older than acknowledged? It is here that the idea of a deliberate reset begins to take shape. Fires consume one city after another, not in random intervals, but in uncanny succession. Chicago in 1871, Boston in 1872, St. John in 1877, Moscow decades earlier. Each blaze is described in near-apocalyptic terms, consuming not only wood but also stone, melting iron, toppling buildings said to be indestructible. After each fire, the city is rebuilt in a new style, often less ornate, more utilitarian, aligned with industrial expansion. It is as if the fires were not accidents, but instruments, clearing away the remnants of a civilization whose fingerprints had lingered too long. To entertain this thought is to step into the uneasy space where history and conspiracy intertwine. Mainstream accounts attribute the fires to poor infrastructure, to wooden roofs and crowded streets, to sparks from lamps and carelessness. And yet, why do so many of these disasters mirror one another, not only in devastation, but in effect? Why does the aftermath so often involve a shift in style, a rewriting of urban memory, a cleansing of what once stood? If one were to seek to erase the physical evidence of an earlier civilization, fire would indeed be the most efficient tool. The possibility of a hidden technology intensifies the suspicion. Old photographs often reveal strange devices, spires that seem to function as more than decoration, elaborate metallic structures atop domes, intricate reliefs resembling resonant patterns. To some, these are simply aesthetic choices, but to others, they hint at a forgotten science, perhaps one that harnessed natural energy without wires or combustion. The theories align uncannily with Tesla's visions of wireless power, experiments that briefly illuminated the world before being cast aside. Was Tartaria a civilization that had already achieved what Tesla rediscovered? A mastery of resonance and vibration that could provide abundance without dependence on fuel. If so, one can understand why its memory would be dangerous. To acknowledge Tartaria would be to admit that human progress is not a single, linear path, but a tapestry of branches, many of which have been cut away. It would be to recognize that scarcity, competition, and industrial dependency are not inevitabilities, but choices. Such recognition would destabilize the foundations of modern power, which relies on the narrative that our age alone has achieved what no other has. To conceal Tartaria, then, would be to secure control over not just the present, but the imagination of the future. Still, doubt must be reckoned with. The absence of definitive evidence is the strongest argument against Tartaria. Historians point out that maps labeled Tartary merely reflected ignorance, not knowledge, that Europeans used vague terms until exploration corrected them. The architecture of the 19th century, they argue, was the triumph of skilled craftsmen and industrial innovation, not the inheritance of a lost empire. Fires, they insist, are tragically common, needing no conspiracy to explain their spread. And yet, if all of this is true, why does the suspicion remain so stubborn? Why does the idea of Tartaria refuse to die, returning again and again like a dream half remembered? Perhaps because the suspicion itself is a symptom of something deeper, the recognition that history is not whole. People sense the gaps, the silences, the uncanny vanishing of entire names and empires. They feel the weight of ruins that do not match their official explanations, the resonance of patterns across continents that cannot be easily dismissed. The idea of Tartaria becomes less about proving a civilization's existence and more about questioning the reliability of the stories we have inherited. What else has been omitted? How much of our memory is curated, designed to fit the needs of those who write it? The thought is sobering, for it suggests that history may be less a record of what happened than a record of what was permitted to survive. In that sense, Tartaria is both a possibility and a metaphor, a real civilization perhaps erased, or an imagined one that nevertheless reflects a truth. That erasure is possible, and perhaps far more common than we dare to believe. In the hush of night, when archives grow silent and the echo of lost empires drifts through imagination, Tartaria lingers at the edge of certainty. Was it a vast empire spanning continents, a civilization of knowledge and resonance? Or is it the name we give to the ache of forgetting, the sense that our past is incomplete, our memory fractured? The ruins, the fires, the vanishing of maps, all remain, unyielding in their mystery. And so the question remains, suspended between silence and possibility. If Tartaria was truly erased, what force demanded its disappearance, and what truth was so dangerous that it had to be buried beneath ash and silence? There is a peculiar quality to the way architecture speaks. Unlike words, which can be erased from records, stone resists silence, its weight bearing memory across centuries. In the case of Tartaria, the most haunting clues may not be found in maps or chronicles, but in the silent testimony of buildings whose designs defy the narrative of their time. Across Russia, Central Asia, and far into Europe and America, there are structures that seem to belong to no single culture, their domes rising with mathematical precision, their facades patterned with geometry echoing across continents. Official accounts call them the products of ambitious 19th-century architects, but the repetition of these forms hints at something else, as though a forgotten blueprint continued to resurface despite every effort to erase it. Consider the star forts, scattered across the world like a constellation traced upon the earth. Their bastioned edges form perfect angles, their proportions aligned with principles of resonance and defense. They appear in Italy and the Netherlands, in India and the Caribbean, in Siberia and the American Midwest. The accepted explanation is that European engineers developed the style in the Renaissance and spread it through colonization. Yet the sheer scale of their distribution provokes doubt. How could a single architectural mode spread with such uniformity, appearing in distant lands sometimes before contact with Europe had been firmly established? Perhaps the forts were more than defenses. They may have been instruments, nodes of an energy network that once spanned continents, their geometry designed not only to repel invaders, but to channel forces we no longer understand. Other structures carry the same enigma. Photographs of Moscow before the fires of 1812 reveal palaces and halls of immense scale, some of which vanished without trace after the destruction. In Kazan, Bukhara, and Samarkand, tiled domes shimmer with patterns of fractal repetition, so intricate and advanced that even today artisans struggle to replicate them. In St. Petersburg, monumental facades rise in symmetry so refined it appears almost machine-like. And in North America, the exposition halls of the late 19th century bear uncanny resemblance to these Eurasian forms, as if the architectural language of Tartaria had been transplanted overseas under the guise of World's Fairs. The question grows heavier. Were these exhibitions mere showcases of modern achievement, or staged funerals for an older knowledge, revealing remnants one last time before erasing them? The mystery is sharpened by the strange temporality of these buildings. Many were erected with extraordinary speed, sometimes in less than 2 years, despite their monumental size and elaborate decoration. Official accounts attribute this to temporary construction methods, plaster facades over wooden frames, designed to impress visitors but destined to vanish. Yet photographs reveal surfaces of stone and marble, carvings of such intricacy that they suggest mastery, not temporary artifice. If these buildings were indeed ephemeral, why do they appear more solid, more enduring, than many structures designed to last? Could it be that they were older, inherited from a civilization whose remnants were incorporated into new cities, their origins rewritten under the language of progress? Mainstream historians push back firmly. They argue that architectural styles spread through imitation, through the rapid exchange of ideas in a world increasingly connected by empire and trade. The star forts were simply effective designs, replicated because they worked. The domes and arches of Central Asia were the results of Islamic and Persian influence, refined over centuries of craftsmanship. The exposition halls were temporary marvels, built cheaply and dismantled once their purpose was fulfilled. To believe otherwise, they insist, is to surrender to romantic fantasy. Yet the heart remains unsettled. The repetition, the uncanny similarity, the persistence of geometry across time and place, it feels too deliberate, too resonant to dismiss as coincidence. One cannot ignore the role of fire in this story. Again and again, fires consume the grandest of these structures, leaving behind only rubble and opportunity for rebuilding. The Moscow Fire of 1812, the Chicago Fire of 1871, the fires in Toronto, St. John, San Francisco, each disaster destroyed monuments whose photographs and engravings suggest a refinement beyond their era. Each was followed by rebuilding in styles more aligned with industrial progress, less ornate, less enigmatic. It is as though fire served as the eraser of memory, clearing away the last visible remnants of a civilization too stubborn to vanish on its own. Theories of hidden technology often find their strongest support in architecture. Towers crowned with metallic rods, domes resonating with particular frequencies, facades carved with patterns resembling waveforms. These details suggest more than mere aesthetics. Could buildings themselves have been machines designed to capture or distribute natural energy? Nikola Tesla's experiments at the turn of the 20th century reveal that such ideas were not unthinkable. His dream of wireless energy, of towers transmitting power through the atmosphere, echoes eerily in the spires and domes of Tartarian structures. If Tesla was rediscovering what others had once known, then perhaps architecture itself holds the memory of a science we have forgotten. But even this possibility meets resistance. Without definitive evidence, without devices, writings, or instructions, such interpretations remain speculation. Historians dismiss them as pareidolia, the human tendency to see pattern in chaos. Yet one wonders, if erasure were deliberate, would we expect to find clear evidence? Would not the very point of suppression be to destroy or conceal the mechanisms, leaving behind only shells that appear decorative, emptied of their true function? The silence of evidence may itself be a kind of testimony, a void where once there was presence. Beyond architecture, the maps themselves provoke unease. For centuries, Great Tartary was marked boldly, stretching across a landmass larger than any single European empire. Within it, regions were subdivided: independent Tartary, Chinese Tartary, Siberian Tartary. Then, almost overnight in historical terms, the name disappears. By the 19th century, these lands are absorbed under new titles: Russia, Mongolia, Central Asia. To the mainstream eye, this is simply the result of exploration correcting ignorance. But to the suspicious mind, it looks like a systematic renaming, an absorption of one identity into others, so complete that its memory itself becomes discredited. If one were to erase an empire from history, what better way than to rename its lands, reclassify its people, and declare the word itself obsolete? The parallels to colonial erasure elsewhere are striking. The Maya and Inca empires were described in glowing detail by the first Europeans who encountered them. Yet much of their knowledge and heritage was destroyed under conquest. The codices burned, the temples demolished, the survivors renamed and assimilated. Could Tartaria have suffered a similar fate, its name extinguished not by natural decline, but by deliberate rewriting? The suspicion deepens when one realizes how quickly Tartary has become a taboo term, dismissed as pseudo-history, even as fragments of its presence persist in maps and ruins. Perhaps the greatest mystery is not whether Tartaria existed, but why the idea of it refuses to die. Despite the absence of conclusive proof, the theory returns again and again, drawing new believers, sparking fresh debates. It is as if the human psyche itself senses the incompleteness of history, the way narratives are shaped by those in power. Tartaria, whether real or symbolic, becomes the name we give to that intuition, that what we have been told is not the whole story, that memory has been edited, that silence itself conceals a forgotten truth. And so the ruins remain, silent witnesses to a past that resists disappearance. The domes, the forts, the vanished expositions, the maps erased, all form a tapestry of absence that feels deliberate, heavy with the weight of forgetting. Was Tartaria truly a great civilization, erased to clear the way for modern progress? Or is it the echo of our own recognition that history is fragile, vulnerable to fire, conquest, and silence? The question cannot be answered, not with certainty. But in the shadows of ruined walls, in the geometry of star forts seen from above, in the faded ink of maps that no longer bear its name, the presence of Tartaria lingers like a half-forgotten dream. And perhaps that is the deepest truth of all, that what has been erased never fully disappears, but continues to haunt the edges of memory, asking us to look again, to listen more closely, to wonder what else has been lost to the fires of time. In the quiet corridors of old museums, among cabinets filled with fragments of pottery and faded manuscripts, lies a recurring unease, the absence of continuity. Civilizations are expected to leave trails, lines of development that can be traced from origin to decline. Yet in many regions once labeled as Tartary, the trail breaks. Archaeologists find sudden appearances of advanced architecture without clear precursors, intricate city plans that seem to have emerged fully formed, technologies hinted at in ruins, but never adequately explained. Then, just as abruptly, these features vanish, replaced by simpler forms, as though history itself had stepped backwards. The pattern is not unique to Eurasia. Similar ruptures are seen in Mesopotamia, in the Indus Valley, in Mesoamerica. But in the lands of Tartary, the silence feels heavier, amplified by the deliberate disappearance of its very name. The question of continuity surfaces most sharply when examining the great cities of Central Asia. Samarkand and Bukhara gleam in history as crossroads of knowledge, their blue domes shimmering like frozen fragments of sky. The intricacy of their tile work, the precision of their geometric patterns, and the grandeur of their scale suggest mastery of mathematics, astronomy, and engineering. Yet the origins of these skills remain elusive. Were they truly the products of isolated genius, or the inheritance of something older, carried forward in fragments after a larger whole had been shattered? The thought unsettles, for it suggests that what we call Islamic Golden Age architecture may itself be a palimpsest, built upon the lingering stones of a vanished civilization that once covered half the world. Further north, across Siberia, the puzzle shifts. Entire regions mapped as densely populated in 17th century accounts are now desolate. Explorers wrote of fortified towns, of vast roads stretching like lines of intention through the wilderness. Some even spoke of cultivated fields and canals, yet modern surveys find little but empty plains and scattered ruins whose builders are uncertain. The mainstream explanation is that these travelers exaggerated, projecting visions of grandeur upon lands they barely understood. But why then do their accounts carry such detail, such consistency across different authors and centuries? Could it be that what they saw was real, but later obliterated, either by conquest, catastrophe, or deliberate silence? One of the most haunting anomalies lies in the photographs of 19th century cities. Before their fires and reconstructions, places like Chicago, San Francisco, Moscow, and even smaller provincial towns display monumental architecture with striking similarities. Domes, spires, grand halls whose design echoes the geometry of Central Asia and Europe alike. If these were merely the expressions of a global architectural trend, why do they so often appear older than the dates assigned to them? Why do they seem to have been discovered rather than built, repurposed rather than created anew? The suspicion arises that these cities incorporated Tartarian remnants, structures inherited and rebranded in the rush of industrial modernity. Conflict sharpens this suspicion. Historians insist that every one of these buildings can be accounted for, tied to architects, to blueprints, to construction dates. They point to the rapid rise of industrial capability in the 19th century, to new machinery, to innovations in steel and glass. To them, nothing is mysterious, only misunderstood by those who underestimate human ingenuity. Yet the images remain: colossal halls supposedly built in a matter of months, temporary expositions whose plaster facades look like carved stone, entire city blocks erased by fire before their strangeness could provoke too many questions. The explanations exist, but they do not extinguish the unease. Perhaps the strongest fuel for this unease is the question of technology. Buildings crowned with metallic spires, domes resonating with patterns of sound, entire complexes aligned with geomagnetic lines, all suggest a knowledge that is not strictly architectural. Theories emerge of atmospheric electricity, of resonance harnessed for energy, of vibrations encoded in stone itself. These ideas are not wholly fantastical. Tesla's wireless experiments, the discovery of natural frequencies, the study of acoustic resonance in ancient sites all lend a strange plausibility. Could Tartaria have been a civilization not bound to fire and fuel, but to harmony with forces modern science has only glimpsed? If so, the erasure becomes more comprehensible. To allow memory of such knowledge would undermine the narrative of industrial progress, which thrives upon scarcity, upon the control of resources. A civilization that had tapped into endless energy would threaten the structures of power that emerged in the 19th century. To secure a future built on coal, oil, and empire, the memory of a different path had to vanish. Fires, renaming, demolition, these may have been the tools of that vanishing. But even if Tartaria was only myth, its persistence reveals something important about the human relationship with history. Myths of lost civilizations appear everywhere: Atlantis, Mu, Lemuria, Hyperborea. Each speaks of a time when knowledge exceeded our present, only to be extinguished in cataclysm. The details differ, but the theme repeats: the rise, the mastery, the fall, the forgetting. Why does this theme resonate so universally? Perhaps because it mirrors our own unease with the fragility of memory. Civilizations rise and fall, and with them libraries, archives, entire languages vanish. We know this, and so we intuit that what we possess is incomplete. That much has been lost. Tartaria, whether real or imagined, gives name to that intuition. The danger lies not in whether Tartaria existed, but in what its erasure implies. If names, maps, and ruins can vanish so completely, then what else has been erased? How much of our history is curated, carefully shaped to fit the narratives of the powerful? How many other civilizations have been folded into silence, their achievements rewritten under different banners? To ask these questions is to acknowledge that history is not neutral, but a terrain of struggle, where memory and forgetting are tools of power. In the quiet of night, the thought lingers like smoke after fire. If Tartaria once stood as a civilization vast and luminous, then the world we inhabit today is built upon its ashes. If it never existed, then its myth still tells a truth, that history itself is fragile, and that forgetting is as deliberate as remembering. And so the listener is left with a question not easily dismissed. Is Tartaria a ghost of stone and silence, erased to secure the narrative of modern progress? Or is it the mirror of our own suspicion that we live in a world built upon half-truths, where what has been erased matters as much as what remains? The weight of absence often speaks louder than the presence of evidence. In the story of Tartaria, this absence takes form not only in vanished names on maps or the sudden silence of chronicles, but also in the uncanny discontinuities scattered across the physical world. A bridge whose foundations predate the city that claims to have built it. A cathedral said to be the triumph of 19th century design, yet whose weathered stone suggests an age far older. A canal in Siberia or Central Asia, stretching with mathematical straightness for miles, though no one remembers when it was dug or why. These fragments resist explanation, and yet they are explained away all the same, always attributed to coincidence, to overestimation, to the eagerness of conspiracy. Still, the fragments accumulate, and in their persistence they whisper of something larger. To wander through old photographs of St. Petersburg is to encounter this whisper. The city, often called Russia's window to the west, was supposedly raised from marshland in the 18th century under the vision of Peter the Great. Official histories tell of a sudden blossoming, palaces, cathedrals, colonnades, and plazas springing up in mere decades, as though an entire architectural tradition had arrived overnight. But the images provoke unease. The sheer volume of monumental buildings, their intricate details, their massive proportions. How could so much have been achieved in so little time? Were these structures truly built in the 18th and 19th centuries, or were they remnants of something earlier, incorporated into the fabric of a modern empire and claimed as its own? The same unease arises in other cities. Kazan, long a meeting point of cultures, displays a fusion of domes and spires that seems too harmonious to be accidental. In Samarkand, mosques and madrasas rise with patterns so refined they evoke not mere ornament, but a hidden mathematics, as though architecture itself was designed to echo cosmic rhythms. In Moscow, before the fire of 1812, vast structures appeared in engravings and paintings, many of which vanished in the flames, replaced by new designs aligned with the age of empire. Again and again, fire appears as the agent of disappearance, clearing the ground for new narratives. Theories of Tartarian technology often return to these buildings. The spires and domes, with their metallic ornaments and curious shapes, resemble devices more than decorations. Some speculate that they functioned as collectors of atmospheric electricity, part of a network that could power entire cities without wires or combustion. The idea seems impossible, yet Tesla himself pursued similar visions centuries later, constructing towers designed to transmit energy through resonance. Was he the first? Or was he rediscovering fragments of a knowledge already lost? If buildings were machines, then architecture itself becomes a kind of text, a record of science encoded in stone and metal. To erase Tartaria would then be to erase not only a culture, but an entire technology. The mainstream response is blunt. Historians explain the speed of construction in terms of labor, wealth, and imperial ambition. St. Petersburg, they argue, was built by vast armies of workers, marshaled at immense human cost. The domes of Central Asia are the culmination of centuries of Islamic and Persian artistry. The fires were tragic but common, fueled by wooden roofs and dense streets. As for atmospheric energy, it is dismissed as fantasy, unsupported by evidence beyond coincidence and speculation. The official explanations are tidy, rational, safe. Yet safety itself can be suspicious, especially when it is applied so uniformly, leaving no room for anomalies. Perhaps what unsettles most is the repetition of erasure. Time and again, history reveals patterns of destruction and rewriting. The burning of the Library of Alexandria, the razing of Mayan codices, the deliberate dismantling of indigenous cities in the Americas, all acts not of natural decline, but of conquest. Memory is fragile, and when empires rise, they decide what to preserve and what to destroy. If Tartaria was real, then its erasure would not be unique, but part of a long tradition, one in which forgetting is as much a weapon as armies or fire. There is also the matter of language. Words carry memory, and when words are erased, entire worlds vanish with them. Tartary once stood boldly on maps, subdivided into regions: Great Tartary, Independent Tartary, Chinese Tartary, Siberian Tartary. Then, without transition, the name disappears. In its place emerge Russia, Mongolia, Turkestan, Siberia, labels that fit the imperial order of the 19th century. The renaming is so thorough that even to speak of Tartary today invites dismissal. And yet, this is how erasure works. by rendering the very word suspect, by making the act of remembering itself a conspiracy. What greater sign of power than the ability to decide not only what is true, but what may be spoken at all? Against this silence, fragments of folklore persist. Siberian tales speak of towers that reached the heavens, of great floods that swallowed entire nations. Central Asian myths recall golden palaces and lost kings, stories handed down long after their supposed origins had vanished. Such myths are often dismissed as symbolic, yet symbols too are rooted in memory. They may not tell us exactly what was, but they remind us that something once was, something worth remembering. If Tartaria never existed, then why do so many stories echo its themes? Why do so many fragments converge upon the same absence? The suspicion grows heavier when one considers the broader web of lost civilizations. Atlantis drowned beneath the sea, Mu scattered across the Pacific, Hyperborea buried in the ice. Each tale differs in detail, but all carry the same rhythm: a great civilization, a sudden erasure, a lingering memory. Could Tartaria be another verse in this ancient song? One less mythological and more historical, hidden not by natural disaster but by conquest and silence? If so, then its story is perhaps the most dangerous of all, not because of what it was, but because of what it means. To admit Tartaria would be to admit that history is not linear, that progress is not inevitable, that our world is built upon layers of forgetting. In the end, the question circles back not to proof, but to possibility. Was Tartaria truly a civilization erased to clear the way for modern empire, its monuments consumed by fire, and its name struck from maps? Or is it the reflection of a deeper intuition, that history as we know it is curated, shaped, and incomplete? Either way, the suspicion cannot be silenced. The ruins, the fires, the vanished words, all conspire to remind us that memory is fragile, and that what we call history may be only one of many possible stories. As the echoes of lost cities fade into the silence of night, the listener is left with a thought that resists closure. If Tartaria truly existed, then its erasure was not merely an accident of time, but a decision whose consequences still shape the world we live in. And if it never existed, then perhaps the human longing for it reveals an even greater truth, that what has been erased continues to haunt us, reminding us that forgetting is never complete, and that the past is far stranger than we dare to imagine. There is a peculiar stillness in the ruins of old fortresses when seen from above. Satellite imagery today, like the maps of earlier centuries, reveals outlines that are not accidental. Perfect stars carved into earth and stone, moats and bastions laid out with geometric certainty, their symmetry echoing across continents. In India, in Italy, in the Caribbean, and across the frozen expanse of Siberia, the pattern repeats, as though the earth itself had once been inscribed with a single code. Historians call them military innovations of the Renaissance, designed to repel cannon fire, spread outward by empire. Yet to see them mirrored in places far beyond the reach of early European conquest provokes unease. Could these star forts be remnants of a different order, part of a network that once covered the globe, a silent architecture whose purpose has been forgotten? The theory finds resonance in other anomalies. Old photographs of North American cities show courthouses and exhibition halls crowned with domes identical to those in St. Petersburg or Samarkand. In Central Asia, tiled patterns repeat the same fractal geometry found in Moorish Spain. In Siberia, reports from the 17th century speak of walled towns and roads so precise they seemed traced by an invisible hand. The explanation that such forms simply spread through trade and colonization feels too neat, too linear. What if these structures were not isolated achievements, but fragments of a larger system? An inheritance of Tartaria, whose memory was later divided among empires and attributed to them. Conflict arises when mainstream scholarship intervenes. Engineers explain the forts as practical responses to the changing nature of warfare. Architects argue that domes and arches are inevitable, discovered independently by cultures responding to the same physical principles. Historians insist that travel, conquest, and imitation are enough to account for any similarity. To them, Tartaria is no more than a phantom, a projection of conspiracy onto coincidence. And yet, the repetition continues to haunt the imagination. When geometry persists across distance and time without direct connection, is it not reasonable to wonder whether it points to a forgotten source? The web of mystery deepens when fire is considered. The 19th century saw entire cities erased in flames: Chicago, Boston, San Francisco, Moscow, St. John, Toronto. Each disaster destroyed monumental architecture whose origins were already uncertain, clearing the ground for new styles aligned with industrial modernity. Wooden buildings burn easily, but photographs suggest that many of the structures consumed were stone, masonry, even iron. How could fire undo them so completely? Was it mere chance that so many vanished in similar fashion? Or was fire itself an instrument of erasure, chosen to remove the lingering presence of Tartarian inheritance? Beyond fire lies another silence, that of language. The very word Tartary, once emblazoned across maps, disappears almost entirely in the 19th century. In its place, the names of new empires emerge: Russia, China, Mongolia, Turkestan. The erasure is so total that to mention Tartary today is to invite dismissal, as though the act of remembering has itself become taboo. Yet words are powerful. To erase a name is to erase identity, to scatter memory into fragments too fragile to cohere. If Tartaria never existed, why then was the effort to remove its name so complete? The possibility of technology adds another layer to the unease. Domes crowned with metallic ornaments, towers resembling antennas, facades carved with resonant patterns. These details suggest more than mere aesthetics. Some researchers propose that these were machines disguised as architecture, instruments for harnessing natural forces, for gathering atmospheric electricity or manipulating vibration. The idea is ridiculed by most, yet Tesla's experiments with wireless power show that such visions were not beyond imagination. Could it be that Tartaria had once achieved what modern science only began to rediscover? A technology of resonance that was silenced to secure the dominance of industrial power? If this is true, then Tartaria's erasure was not simply the loss of a civilization, but the burial of an alternative path for humanity. Imagine a world built not upon scarcity, but upon abundance drawn from the harmonics of the earth itself. Such a world would not require the empires of coal, oil, and steel. It would not serve the interests of those who rose to power in the 19th century. To erase Tartaria would thus be to secure a future shaped by control, by dependency, by narratives of progress that deny the possibility of other ways. But doubt intrudes. Skeptics insist that the evidence is too thin, the anomalies too easily explained by ordinary history. Forts are forts, domes are domes, fires are fires. The absence of clear proof condemns Tartaria to the realm of fantasy. And yet, absence itself can be suspicious. When so many fragments point toward a possibility, when so many silences align, one begins to suspect that the void is not natural but constructed. If evidence has been destroyed, then absence is exactly what one would expect to find. This is the paradox at the heart of Tartaria. It may never be provable, and yet the suspicion of its erasure remains compelling. The human mind senses when something is missing, when the story feels incomplete. Myths of lost civilizations, Atlantis, Mu, Hyperborea, recur precisely because they express this intuition, this recognition that history is fragile, that forgetting is as deliberate as remembering. Tartaria joins their company not because it is identical, but because its absence feels deliberate, its silence too heavy to ignore. Perhaps what matters is not whether Tartaria existed, but what its possibility reveals. It reminds us that the past is not immutable, that memory is shaped by power, that entire empires can vanish from maps and minds in the span of a generation. It challenges us to question the narratives we inherit, to see history not as a linear march, but as a fragile palimpsest, written and rewritten, each version concealing as much as it reveals. And so the ruins remain, scattered across continents, their geometry too precise to be dismissed, their silence too eloquent to be ignored. The star forts, the domes, the vanished names, the cities consumed by fire, all conspire to form a shadowy outline, a whisper of a civilization erased. Whether Tartaria was real or imagined, the question lingers, suspended between silence and possibility. In the stillness of night, one is left with a thought that refuses closure. If Tartaria truly existed, then its erasure was the greatest act of forgetting in human history. And if it never existed, then the longing for it reveals an even greater truth, that what has been lost continues to haunt us, that memory itself resists erasure, and that history is always larger, stranger, and more fragile than the stories we are allowed to keep. In the pale light of early morning, when the world seems half dream, there is a sense that the earth itself holds memories we have forgotten. Rivers that once carried ships now run through empty plains, their courses strangely straight, their banks carved with an order that feels unnatural. Across Siberia and Central Asia, traces of canals, dikes, and earthworks appear faintly from the sky, lines etched into landscapes where, officially, no great civilization ever flourished. To dismiss them as geological quirks is easy. But when these lines stretch for kilometers, intersecting in patterns, one cannot help but wonder, were they the veins of Tartaria, remnants of a vanished system of water and power? The enigma deepens when we look at the chronicles of travelers. From Jesuit missionaries to Russian explorers, accounts from the 17th and 18th centuries describe regions that seem more populous and sophisticated than later histories allow. Towns with wide avenues, fortified walls, markets filled with goods from distant lands. Yet within a century, these towns vanish from maps, as though they had dissolved into the earth. Scholars dismiss these accounts as exaggerations, misunderstandings of nomadic encampments, but the descriptions carry too much detail, too much consistency, to be illusions. Could it be that the travelers saw remnants of Tartaria just before they were swallowed by conquest, by silence, or by fire? In North America, the mystery takes another form. The so-called mud flood theory, controversial and dismissed by most, insists that many cities contain layers of buried architecture, windows and doors sunken beneath present street levels, suggesting that buildings now considered 19th century were already standing, partially covered by some unknown event. Photographs reveal facades where the ground meets halfway up a window, entire basements that look like former ground floors. Is this merely the result of urban development, of streets raised and landscapes altered? Or could it be the faint echo of a global cataclysm, a sudden flood of earth and mud that buried remnants of an earlier world? If such an event occurred, could it have erased the last traces of Tartaria, leaving only fragments hidden beneath modern cities? Conflict emerges between speculation and explanation. Engineers point to the practicality of raised streets, of new sewer systems, of rebuilding after fires. Urban change is common, they argue. Nothing mysterious is required. Yet the photographs provoke a different kind of silence. Why are there so many examples across continents? Why do these patterns recur in cities as distant as St. Petersburg, Paris, San Francisco, and Sydney? Could such global similarity be mere coincidence, or is it the residue of a forgotten reset? The suspicion grows when one considers how often resets appear in human history. The Bronze Age collapse scattered empires across the Mediterranean. The fall of Rome erased centuries of knowledge in Western Europe. In each case, memory was fractured, leaving only fragments to be pieced together centuries later. Could the 19th century have been another such rupture? One masked as progress, explained as industrial revolution, yet in truth serving to overwrite a civilization that did not fit the new order? Fires, floods, and demolitions. Perhaps these were not accidents, but tools of transition, instruments of forgetting. The idea of Tartarian technology intertwines with this suspicion. Old photographs show spires and domes crowned with metallic devices, their forms strangely reminiscent of antennas. Could these have been designed to gather atmospheric electricity, providing light and power without wires? Theorists point to the world's fairs, where buildings were said to glow with illumination long before the widespread adoption of electrical grids. Explanations speak of generators, of hidden wires, of temporary infrastructure. But to those who look closely, the scale of the illumination seems extraordinary, almost impossible for the time. Was it truly the triumph of modern engineers, or was it the demonstration of a technology inherited, displayed one last time, then buried in silence? The opposition is strong. Historians insist that every detail can be explained. The mud flood is urban alteration, the illumination is early electricity, the domes and spires are decoration. To them, Tartaria is a fantasy born of mistrust, a conspiracy that flourishes in the gaps of knowledge. And yet, the mistrust itself has meaning. For when history is complete and transparent, there is little room for suspicion. It is only when silence is too deep, when erasure too thorough, that doubt blossoms. The persistence of the Tartarian question reveals not gullibility, but a recognition that history, as it is told, feels incomplete. This incompleteness is not limited to ruins or maps. It is felt in the universal recurrence of myth. Every culture speaks of floods, of cataclysms, of civilizations lost to water, fire, or ice. Atlantis in the Atlantic, Lemuria in the Pacific, Hyperborea in the Arctic night. These tales may be symbolic, yet their universality suggests memory, an echo of events too vast to be forgotten entirely. If Tartaria joins their company, it may not be as myth alone, but as the historical face of the same truth: that human civilization has risen and fallen more than once, and that what we call progress is not a straight line, but a cycle of remembering and forgetting. To walk through a modern city with this thought is to see it differently. Beneath the pavements may lie older streets, beneath the facades older structures, beneath the archives older truths. History is layered, and each layer conceals as much as it reveals. Tartaria, whether real or imagined, becomes the name for what has been buried, the ghost of what still lingers beneath our feet. In the quiet of night, one is left with a haunting image, a civilization erased not by the slow erosion of centuries, but by a sudden act of silence. Its cities buried, its monuments burned, its names struck from maps, its technology dismantled or hidden. All that remains are fragments, photographs of impossible buildings, maps with vanished words, ruins with forgotten geometry. To look upon them is to feel the pull of memory, the sense that something vast has been taken from us. And so the question refuses to vanish. Were the buried windows and sunken streets signs of nothing more than mundane urban change, or were they the last traces of a cataclysm that reset the world? Were the glowing domes of the expositions triumphs of modern invention, or echoes of Tartarian science displayed one final time before erasure? Was the disappearance of Tartary from maps the natural refinement of knowledge, or the deliberate silencing of an empire that contradicted the story we were meant to believe? The silence does not answer. It only deepens, like a shadow at the edge of memory. And within that silence, the whisper persists. If Tartaria truly existed, then its erasure is the greatest enigma of our history. And if it never existed, then our longing for it reveals an even deeper truth, that we sense the incompleteness of the story we have been given, and that we know, in our quietest moments, that history remembers less than it has forgotten. There are moments when history feels less like a record of fact than a carefully woven fabric. Each thread chosen, others removed, until the pattern tells a story convenient to those who hold the loom. The tale of Tartaria lingers in that uneasy space, where threads seem to have been deliberately cut, leaving holes too large to ignore. Maps that once bore its name vanish without explanation. Cities rebuilt after mysterious fires emerge in forms that erase what stood before. Photographs reveal architectural splendor attributed to modern ambition, yet their scale and detail whisper of something older, something inherited. The fabric of history here is not smooth. It is stitched over ruptures that refuse to remain hidden. When one examines the great expositions of the 19th century, this sense of rupture grows sharper. The White City of Chicago in 1893, the Paris Exposition of 1889, the St. Louis World's Fair of 1904, each presented monumental architecture, domes and palaces so vast that visitors believed they were seeing the future. But photographs suggest something else. Structures of stone and marble, carved with intricacy, built with speed that strains belief. Official accounts claim these were temporary constructions, plaster facades meant to dazzle and then vanish. Yet their solidity is unmistakable, their ornamentation too refined for temporary display. Why build palaces only to destroy them months later? Was it truly spectacle, Or was it the final unveiling of remnants, presented as new before being erased altogether? Theories grow from this dissonance. Some suggest that the fairs were not celebrations of progress, but funerals for the old world, a way to display the last fragments of Tartarian heritage before consigning them to fire or demolition. Others believe they were experiments in memory, teaching the public to accept erasure, to marvel at splendor only to watch it vanish without question. Whatever the truth, the expositions embody the paradox of Tartaria, the presence of grandeur explained as illusion, the solidity of stone dismissed as plaster, the persistence of form denied by narrative. In the shadow of these doubts stands the role of technology. The fairs dazzled visitors with displays of light, fountains glowing with luminescence, streets illuminated without visible wires. Explanations cite hidden generators, carefully arranged infrastructure. But the scale of illumination in cities not yet fully electrified feels uncanny. Was this the triumph of modern engineers, or the display of technology inherited from an erased civilization? The spires and domes, with their metallic crowns, resemble instruments as much as decorations. Could they have been designed to gather or transmit natural energy, their function now lost beneath the story of progress? Mainstream historians are unyielding. They insist that the fairs were temporary by design, that electricity was a marvel of its age, that every building has a documented architect, every device a clear inventor. To them, Tartaria is a fiction born of mistrust, a fantasy stitched together from coincidence and misinterpretation. And yet, mistrust itself has meaning. It arises not from ignorance, but from the recognition that stories often fail to account for what we see with our own eyes. When buildings that appear carved from stone are said to be plaster, when palaces vanish without a trace, suspicion takes root. Suspicion deepens with the study of resets. Human history is punctuated by them. The collapse of the Bronze Age, the fall of Rome, the devastation of indigenous civilizations in the Americas. Each time, knowledge is lost, memory fractured, and the survivors inherit fragments they barely understand. Could the 19th century have been another such reset, its fires, floods, and expositions serving as instruments of transition? If so, Tartaria's erasure would not be anomaly, but part of a pattern, the deliberate forgetting of what no longer serves those in power. The implications are unsettling. If Tartaria had mastered forms of energy rooted in resonance, in vibration, in harmony with the natural world, then its disappearance marks not just the loss of a civilization, but the suppression of an alternative path. Modern progress, built upon fossil fuels and scarcity, may not have been inevitable but chosen, secured by the erasure of a rival way. To admit Tartaria would be to admit that history is not a single line of advancement, but a contested field where some futures were destroyed so that others could prevail. Yet even if Tartaria is no more than myth, its persistence is significant. Myths are not lies. They are expressions of collective intuition. The human mind senses the incompleteness of history, the way narratives leave gaps too large to ignore. Myths of Atlantis, Hyperborea, Lemuria, all speak of civilizations lost, of knowledge drowned or buried, of resets that shape the world we inhabit. Tartaria joins their chorus, but with a sharper edge, for its traces remain in photographs, in maps, in ruins. Its absence is not ancient, but modern, its erasure not the work of time alone, but of deliberate silence. Perhaps that is why the idea of Tartaria is so unsettling. It does not belong to the distant past, but to the recent one, close enough to touch, close enough that its erasure feels intentional. It reminds us that forgetting is not always natural, that memory can be shaped, rewritten, imposed. It asks us to consider how much of our world is built not upon what we remember, but upon what we have been taught to forget. The image that lingers is haunting. Vast cities with domes and towers, their streets illuminated by forces we no longer understand, their designs echoing across continents. Then suddenly, fire and demolition, renaming and silence, until nothing remains but fragments scattered across archives and ruins. Was this Tartaria, or only the echo of our longing for completeness? Either way, its absence remains eloquent. As the night deepens, the thought circles back. History is fragile, and what we inherit is not the whole, but the part that was permitted to survive. Whether Tartaria was a real empire, or a reflection of our own unease, it reveals a truth we cannot dismiss, that forgetting is as deliberate as remembering, and that what has been erased may shape us more deeply than what remains. And so the question persists, unanswered yet inescapable. If the world we inhabit was built upon the ashes of Tartaria, then what was taken from us? And who decided that we would never know? At the edge of every story lies the question of why. If Tartaria truly existed, vast enough to cover half the world, rich enough to leave monuments and maps, then why did it vanish so completely? Why do we find only fragments, star forts without histories, domes without origins, maps without explanation? Civilizations collapse, yes, but they usually leave behind continuity. Rome in the ruins of Europe, the Maya in their pyramids, Egypt in its temples and texts. Tartaria, if it lived, left only silence, and silence is often not natural. It is crafted, imposed, carried out with purpose. To look at Tartaria is to face the possibility that forgetting itself was an act of power. The 19th century looms large in this suspicion. Fires tore through city after city, reshaping urban landscapes, erasing ornate architecture, and ushering in a new industrial aesthetic. World's fairs rose and fell, presenting monumental palaces only to dismantle them immediately after. Maps shifted, erasing names that had persisted for centuries. This was also the century of empire, when Britain, Russia, and others redrew the borders of the world. In such an age, the memory of Tartaria, whether as empire, culture, or even a hint of alternative science, would have been inconvenient. A rival narrative, incompatible with the story of linear progress from ignorance to modernity. To erase it was to secure the authority of the present. But if Tartaria was erased, it may not have been the first time. Throughout human history, resets have occurred. Periods when memory was broken, when knowledge was destroyed, when silence descended. The burning of the Library of Alexandria, the collapse of the Bronze Age, the fall of empires whose names we no longer speak. Each time, survivors inherited fragments, building anew without knowing fully what had come before. Could Tartaria have been caught in such a reset, its memory extinguished not by nature but by deliberate will? If so, then perhaps its true story is not one of conquest, but of suppression. A reminder that history is not simply what happened, but what was allowed to be remembered. The possibility of forgotten technology sharpens this thought. The domes and spires of old buildings, their metallic crowns and intricate carvings, suggest more than ornament. Theories speak of resonance, vibration, atmospheric electricity, a science that could harness the natural forces of the Earth without fuel. Tesla's visions at the turn of the 20th century echo these possibilities. Was he rediscovering fragments of what Tartaria once knew? If such knowledge existed, then its suppression becomes even more understandable. A civilization built on free and abundant energy would threaten the very foundations of industrial power. To ensure control of the future, the memory of that past had to be extinguished. Skeptics, of course, argue otherwise. They point to architectural records, to engineers' blueprints, to accounts of construction that explain each building, each fair, each fort. To them, Tartaria is nothing more than a conspiracy theory, a projection of modern distrust onto old maps and photographs. But even this dismissal reveals something: the persistence of doubt. Myths do not endure unless they touch a nerve, unless they speak to an unease within us. Tartaria endures because people sense the incompleteness of history, the way narratives shift to serve those who tell them. Whether or not Tartaria was real, its story reveals a truth about power, that forgetting is as potent as remembering, and that silence can be more deliberate than speech. Perhaps the deepest question is not whether Tartaria existed, but what its erasure means for us. If history can be rewritten so thoroughly, then how much of what we take for certain is fragile, contingent, chosen? How many other civilizations lie buried, unnamed, unremembered, their stories erased because they did not serve the victors of their time? Tartaria becomes a mirror, reflecting our own vulnerability to the shaping of memory. It reminds us that the past is not fixed, that it can be molded, that truth itself can be buried beneath ash and silence. The myth of Tartaria, then, is not merely about a lost empire. It is about the fragility of human memory, the ease with which entire worlds can be erased, the haunting possibility that our story is incomplete. Whether it was real or imagined, it teaches the same lesson: that forgetting is never neutral, that absence is often designed. And in this recognition lies the true mystery, deeper than any ruins or maps. The awareness that we live in the aftermath of many erasures, that our present is built not only on what we know, but on what has been made to vanish. In the stillness of night, when the mind drifts between waking and dream, one can almost hear the echo of what has been lost. Towers that hummed with resonance, cities glowing with a light no longer understood, maps bearing names erased by conquest. Whether they belonged to Tartaria or only to imagination, they call to us with the same question: what has been forgotten, and what was taken so that we would never know? And so the story closes, not with certainty, but with silence. Tartaria remains a shadow, a whisper, a possibility. Real or imagined, it embodies the truth that memory is fragile, that history is curated, that forgetting can be as decisive as remembering. The ruins, the fires, the vanished names, all remain unanswered, and perhaps they always will. Yet perhaps it is fitting that the story ends not with resolution, but with a question. For questions linger longer than answers. They echo in the quiet of night, urging us to listen, to wonder, to remain uneasy. If Tartaria truly was erased, then its ghost still walks among us, not in stone or map, but in the haunting suspicion that what we know is only part of the story, and that what has been forgotten still shapes us in ways we cannot yet see.